Good evening and welcome to our program, Jones and Company. I'm your host, Christian Jones, and I'm very happy to be hosting this episode of Jones and Company as we celebrate the 30th anniversary of Love 97 FM radio. Jones and Company being one of those early programs on Love 97 FM radio that helped to open the airwaves, that helped to change the dynamic in terms of public speech and public debate. I'm glad to be joined on this episode by one of those very pioneers of radio, Mr. Jeffrey Lloyd. Mr. Lloyd, welcome to Jones and Company.
Thank you so very much, and congratulations.
Thank you, sir.
Yes,
and I have to also offer you congratulations because this accomplishment, this anniversary, is just as much yours as it is ours. And when I invited you to participate in this interview, the first thing I think in terms of what I said I wanted to talk about was the legacy of shows such as Issues of the Day, which you hosted, our daily talk show on Love 97 FM, as well as Face Off, which was your evening talk show on Love 97 Radio. But looking back on the now 30-year history of the expansion of media in the country, of the freeing of the airwaves, and the legacy that has had, I'm sure that you look back now, especially having gone into government, having been a minister of the cabinet, with much more appreciation for media and what it provides to everyday life for the average Bahamian.
Well, firstly, thank you very much, Mr. Jones, and I am, endlessly proud of your dad for the courage. Of course, he has always exhibited a courageous posture. After he left ZNS, he started his own public relations firm and then eventually a newspaper, which was quite an adventure, of course. But I went to school in Xavier University and studied journalism, eventually becoming one of the editors of the campus newspaper, which was an exercise in itself, as I'm sure you know. And I always wanted to be a news reporter. I eventually became a member of ZNS on February the 18th, 1974, at which time your father was already employed, and we more or less formed a team of young cub reporters who were sent out to do various stories. Now, do understand that in those days, until 1992-3, there were no independent broadcast voices. You had an independent newspaper, the Tribune, but essentially any radio, and there was no television, any radio was controlled by the government. You had 1540, which was more or less for the family islands, and then 1240 played our young people kind of music. Right. So it was an extraordinary time, of course, in the development of our country. We had just become independent, 1973. My very first assignment was to go around the country speaking to various people in different family islands and asking them, how has been independence for you? It's only a year now, so you couldn't expect very much. And I went to, the southern islands, Maguana Island, Crooked Island, and so on. And then, of course, 1992 came, at which time, by that time, your father's newspaper, now the Bahama Journal, was required reading. And it had entered into a kind of a projection of independence and interrogation with the powers that be. And I think that the political directorate of the day began to sense the winds of change in the minds, hearts of the Bahamian people in terms of a demand for more ability, greater ability to express themselves in the public domain, particularly by way of the radio and if eventually television, which came in sometime in 1978 or thereabouts in terms of ZNS. So when your father launched this paper and he started to become very critical of the government and some of the other activities of the society, he was eventually, by way of his application, chosen to have a radio station. And of course, we had worked together intimately for many years, your dad and I. I used to write a column in the papers and different things, do stories for him. And immediately, upon receiving this license, he asked me to become the news director, which I eventually did, and as you indicated, Face Off was my evening program, and then eventually I took over the hosting of Issues of the Day. Some say tissues of the day, but issues of the day, because it used to make a lot of people cry.
Right.
So we entered into an environment, Mr. Jones, which was prolific, dynamic, and filled with excitement. We could not imagine where it would eventually take us as it has today.
Right.
And of course, we brought, Mr. Jones, your dad, and I brought that ancient, honorable ethic of journalism to that expression of Love 97. And of course, he started Jones and Company 5 o'clock in the afternoon. Again, required listening. Nobody dared to interfere with their 5 o'clock hour because he usually had the political leaders of the day and put the various questions to them. Mr. Ingram was a feature of the program, as well as many others, including Sir Lyndon and so on. And we were fearless. And we put the questions, and we came prepared and requested a certain level of response. In fact, I would profit to suggest that we were the ones that introduced the terminology which has now become extremely popular, transparency and accountability. It was us, right. Mr. Jones and his team at Love 97 in the day. And so we found ourselves in a truly transformational moment. Now, I know the word transformation has been bandied about in recent years, and it's more or less lost its true sense and essence, because it really talks about a transition in state of being, not just about change. Right. And change that was disruptive. I mean, now people were able to express themselves without fear of retribution, incrimination, certainly victimization. Right. And they did so in a respectful way, mind you, but they did so with great alacrity. I mean, they emphasized themselves and I'm proud to say that Mr. Ingram fostered that environment. In fact, I could remember many times that he would chide public servants, permanent secretaries, directors, for not responding to reporters' questions. Why not? You're a public servant. You're in a position of leadership. Why aren't you answering questions? He would chide them publicly as well as privately, I understand. So it was an amazing time, and I can't believe it's 30 years. It's been an incredible time, and you know, I had a significant run of almost 25 years in media in the sense of talk shows and all that, but I began back in 1979, 50 years this year.
Right. Right. Congratulations.
I'm a grandfather in the business.
On heading to that next milestone, in terms of soon celebrating 60 years. But I read an editorial you wrote this morning, Mr. Lloyd, that was published in the Bahama Journal this morning, that spoke to the same sort of things that we're talking about now, the history of face-off, issues of the day, Love 97, and what the opening of the airwaves achieved for the Commonwealth of the Bahamas. And you briefly at the beginning of the article sort of touch on the history, sort of what we're doing now, but you say that the level of vitriol amongst the public toward the government at that time made it absolutely necessary for the airwaves to be open. And I want to talk a bit about that time in terms of the late 80s, the early 90s, the transition from a PLP government to now a new Free National Movement government that took over with the mantra, a government in the sunshine.
Well, please understand, Mr. Jones, that at that time, the Bahamian people had moved essentially past the governing party of the day, which was the Progressive Liberal Party. In some people's minds, the 1987 general election was won by the opposition, save and except for whatever, incidences may have occurred at that time. The people lost a considerable amount of faith in the Progressive Liberal Party, going back to the Brian Ross's report on NBC and all of the black eye that the country, nation for sale and so forth. It brought our nation into quite a disrepute, and we were the laughing stock of the world, essentially. I traveled around. I was living in the United States at the time, and I was working at AT&T, and I could remember the report that morning, and when I went to work, I was peppered with questions about my country, which I had no justifiable answer to. In fact, I was surprised about what was revealed. So there were some dark days in that period, and of course, it also awoken the Bahamian people's courage to speak out. and to demand a response from their government. And so when the Free National Movement became government in 1992, there was a bulging appetite for a liberated expression. And instantly, once we formed Love 97 and had those talk shows, we were flooded. I mean, I was fielding 40 and 50 calls a day, imagine that, on any subject that we would have put on. And it didn't have to only do political, but of course, how politics affect the lives of people in such a magnanimous way. Naturally, those were the main topics of our conversation. And as a result of that, people began to see their government in a brand new way. I mean, now you truly could understand and not only see their government, but demand to see more of what their government was doing. What are these heads of agreement? What are the terms of those agreements? Because immediately after we became Love 97, that is when Sun International, Kerzner, and those came to the Bahamas, and Mr. Ingram was a guest on our program, signing a heads of agreement. Mr. Jones and myself went up to, what is it? What is it that you're obligating the Commonwealth of the Bahamas to? What is the benefit that we are going to get from a South African businessman into this country with a history of South Africa, and so on and so forth? You couldn't dare ask those questions before that time of the political law and so on. But not only, and I give credit again to the opportunities provided by Mr. Ingram and his administration, you were encouraged to. And the Bahamians, of course, took advantage of that. So when I tell you it was transformational, my children cannot begin to appreciate what life was before that and what it potentially is now for them. They don't have to worry about writing letters to the editor and it's squashed, or coming on the radio and expressing themselves and criticizing whomever and whatever they wish without fear that something is going to happen on a negative nature. So yeah, we're in a good way in this country. Now, journalism is another matter, but I'm sure we'll come to that.
Right. But you're a professional journalist, Mr. Lloyd, and you spoke about the fact that in the late 80s you would have moved on to another career. My father as well would have moved out of journalism on to another career or into another field, a related field, but not an active journalist. Is it because of the conditions at the time, the fact that there was not that level of independence in journalism that possibly could have caused you and other journalists like yourselves to leave the field of journalism?
That and a number of other factors, but let me just deal with that particular factor. Absolutely. Let me give you an example. I worked at ZNS for 5 months, and I remember one day I was sent to the magistrate's court. Put yourself at the public library on Shirley Street. Right. The building that is east to that was a courthouse. On the upstairs was a court that sat the chief magistrate, the late Emmanuel Osadabe. So I am sent there as a reporter, and I am told to, of course, bring back a story because American fugitive financier Robert Vesco was appearing. Right. And there was a case against him for extradition back to the United States. He was being represented by the late Sir Cecil Wallace Whitfield. No problem. I watch the proceedings. I come back to the station and I write out my story. American fugitive financier Robert Vesco was arraigned in the magistrate court this morning on charges of such. Okay, no problem. By the time I got back, it would have been about 12 o'clock. So I had time for the story to be prepared and reported at the 1 o'clock news, which was the news time of the day. And somewhere around 2 or 2:30, a call was made. Who wrote that story? Jeff Lloyd. It's not true. And it never was heard again. Now, I'm a young reporter. I've been trained in the United States about what it, so on and so forth. You got your 5 W's and an H, who, what, when, why, where, and how. And so you do what you're supposed to do. But for you to be told it isn't true, I saw it with my own 2 eyes. And I know what I wrote. That began a stab in my credibility in the possibility of remaining in this profession. As much as I loved it, I went to school and got a degree in communications, primarily journalism. both radio and television, newspaper, and now to have that. So, yes, okay? And I think that we lost, the Darrell Millers of the world, your father and myself, and a number of others who could have made a major contribution to the understanding of the public in terms of what is going on in their society. And again, not only in politics, but certainly in politics, by way of an unfettered freedom to do the things that you could do from a professional journalistic standpoint. Not to carry the bag for anybody. You were not an ideologue agent for any particular political party or organization and so forth. Right. But in order to provide for the public the opportunity for them to get the information, and then you decide. Right. Okay? And that decision is going to be based not on somebody's opinion, but what is in fact the case, which can be verified and justified by documentation or this or that and so on and so forth. So yeah, there was some frustration in that respect, but your father, I must give him credit. He didn't allow that to intimidate him. He didn't allow that to intimidate him. Again, he went out with the Bahama Journal, and it became really a thorn in the side of the government of the day at the time, all the way between 87 and 92. I mean, Wendell was ferocious, okay? And some would even suggest that because of his fearlessness, that the people's eyes were even more widely opened in terms of what government they were dealing with and what possibilities this country can have in a different environment of political, as it were, maturity.
Right. Mr. Lloyd, we started talking about, you raised the issue at the beginning, the theme of transformations. And some transformations are spontaneous, and some are not. Some you can see the building up to those transformations. Some we are rehearsed for, in some cases even. But as a young journalist then, at that time, even given what that stab to your credibility did you ever think about, did you ever conceive at that point that there was an eventuality or even an inevitability that situation had to change?
I couldn't see it. Remember, this 1974. It was 20 years, approximately 18 years before there was a change. I couldn't see it. The Progressive Liberal Party was at the height of its popularity in 1974. Right. And they came to office in 67, as you know, 6 years later, independence, peak of its popularity. It was no way, in my estimation, that I could begin to imagine that around the corner would be the liberation, as it were, of the professional journalistic field in the Commonwealth of the Bahamas. In fact, when I tendered my resignation to ZNS, I was called in by the late Charles Carter. And he brought me into his office. He was a program director at the time. And he said, I want you to look out through that window, and I did. Across the street, they were laying down the foundations for the television station. And he said, we got high hopes for you. And we would like for you to be one of our anchors on news, and so on and so forth. And I looked at him and said, yeah, I've already tendered my resignation to begin teaching at St. Augustine's. I said, yes, Mr. Carter, I'll think about it. I had no intentions of thinking about it. Because I couldn't imagine me in that environment, where just a couple of months earlier, you tell me the story doesn't exist. It just can't happen. So what am I going to report on a nightly basis? Who am I going to be able to? And then, you couldn't just walk up to a minister coming out of the House of Assembly and ask a question. Not working for ZNS, you had to make an appointment. You had to pretty much ask the questions that, your bosses told you what you could ask. You couldn't, as it were, put them on the spot. No chance. So if this is the only radio station where people, except for, of course, foreign radio stations, where people could get the news about their country, where am I going to fit in? And then you talk about television, how am I going to fit in? With my mind and your father's mind about what journalism should be and how we should make sure that our people are getting the information that they deserve to get and are required to get in a timely fashion without, again, any color of bias, as much as possible, without any color of bias that you are for the PLP or at them days, the FNM or whomever else, all right? So, no, I couldn't say it, Mr. Jones.
Right. And I can't imagine it must be a deep sense of frustration, of internal conflict, especially when you, as you mentioned, you study, you go to university, you're in the United States, the bastion of democracy, and then you come home and the situation, the dynamic is a bit different. It's even more antiquated. I saw a quote recently, Mr. Lloyd, that said, if you hang around people long enough that pretend that you are not who you are, you're going to forget who you are.
Oh, yeah. I absolutely agree with that. And you see, it was a suffocating experience for the aspirational minds of people like us. We were told when we left high school in the late 60s, go and get your education because the opportunities are bright and the possibilities are endless in our country. In my area, it was, of course, journalism, and somebody else's area, whatever, and so on. But even in those areas, you were not free to express yourself, the true, authentic being of your reality, in a way that would be satisfactory to you, that you felt that there could be a possible evolution in your mind, in your thinking, in your outlook, in the realities and so on of your life. I mean, you know, no matter the profession, you more or less were required to toe the line. And the history is replete with examples of this, you would suffer mercilessly. And there are examples of this in persons who went afoul, quote unquote, of the political directorate of the day, who suffered, I mean, big time. You can't get a government job for sure, no question about it. And you certainly would probably be barred from many other opportunities, economic or entrepreneurial opportunities, because the government got to give approvals to those things. Right. Jeffrey Lloyd, no, he's one of them, or whatever he is, you know. He's critical of us, so he doesn't eat. And we make sure his family doesn't eat, type of thing.
Right, but the 19 years from 73 to 1992, we're talking about rapid change in the country. Definitely in the 1970s, when you're talking about the economy, you're talking about more brown and black faces, and which was previously banks where there were only white faces. Why did this rapid growth not trickle down or not diffuse itself to really, when you look at it, the people's ability to express and think independently outside of the government? Well,
I put the question to Sir Lyndon, and he told me that he wanted to open the airwaves, but that his colleagues didn't want to. I said, Sir Lyndon, now this is of course in the new liberated airways environment, so I could put these questions to him without any worries. I said, Sir Lyndon, you know that can't fly. This is on the radio. I say, you know, sir, that can't fly. I mean, nobody's going to tell Sir Lyndon if he really wants to. Okay? He said, no, I'm serious, and so on. That's a good question, and I honestly don't have an answer except this. I think resident within the Bahamian psyche is an inertia, a complacency, where, and still to some degree today, we wait for to be told what to do. As a minister, I found in the public service an environment in which the initiative, the creative genius of our people had been stifled. And I sought to introduce a sense of one's constitutional, legal, statutory responsibility as director or permanent secretary or whatever in that mindset. But if you had been conditioned for X number of decades to act and think a certain way, or suffer some some serious consequences, I could understand why that would be, and it would take a lot of time and trust in you, minister or whomever, that I would not be wrapped over the knuckles and sent to Siberia and the rest of that. I think that is certainly a part of it. I think also a part of it may be, Mr. Jones, that people were doing okay, and I ain't gonna ruffle no feathers. I got a decent job at the bank or in the hotel. I am ascending the ladder in the public service. I'm okay. I could go to Miami 4-6 times a year. I could afford the car I want to. I'm getting a nice house in wherever. I'm not going to ruffle any feathers. I have a somewhat comfortable. My children could go to private school. I'm going to be okay. But also at the same time, concurrently, there beats in the heart of every human being something further. Dr. Michael Beckwith calls it the evolutionary impulse. You want more. You're never satisfied with the status quo. And I think that began to grow on our people, especially as they begin to see the failings of our political directorate, which like I say, in earnest began, in my estimation, with the report by the Nation of Sail and all that stuff, the exposure by the London Times and the Miami Herald, and in those days. Now that is what gave, I think, a significant impetus that change is necessary. As a matter of fact, we're going to demand that there be change.
Right. The presumption has, I think, almost been turned on its head that you can speak out against the government and be subject to any sort of targeted victimization, and it perhaps still can happen, but certainly I probably wouldn't be victimized if I called on a radio station to complain about the government on any given day. I think it happens quite often. But despite the fact that the opening of the airwaves, that the development of radio and now even television in recent times has made the participation of Bahamians in their democracy even more accessible to them, I still think, Mr. Lloyd, there are a lot of people, right, despite the fact that now that presumption has been turned on its head in terms of widespread victimization, that still there are people who are too, or approach too casually this idea of participating in democracy by voicing one's opinion.
Mr. Jones, we are a young nation. I mean, we think of ourselves as 51 years of age and that we are an old nation. We are very, very young. Internal conditioning takes a long time to overcome. And also, in addition to overcoming it, attempting to overcome it, one has to be deliberative in that process. For many of our people, that is not considered a priority. Again, they're managing. They support whatever they support, and they feel quite comfortable. They're not totally satisfied, but they're comfortable in the state of affairs. Now, there's another percentage of our population that wants more, wants better, and I think this is why, since 2002, you keep seeing the switching back and forth, okay? I congratulate the political maturity of our leaders because those, again, in the 70s and the 80s were some dark days in terms of what you used, the word beautifully, targeted victimization. And you were targeted, okay? And you were not only targeted by those who were at the helm, but their supporters. You were ostracized, okay? But I still come back to this resident organic inertia in the minds and the hearts of some of our people, that I rock in no boat, I get my things, I'm okay, and I'm not going to sacrifice my children's meals and the nice lifestyle that I have, even though, I would like it to be better, even though I don't agree with this, and I would like to see different things and a progress, that I'm going to be just okay. Until you have a swelling, a groundswell of a mindset that we deserve better and we will demand better in the larger percentage of the population, not just in a majority, but a larger percentage of the population, you're not going to see what you are describing. I don't personally think that that's going to happen. It's beginning to change, as you know. I mean, 30 years ago, it's just some suggest, 1.5, maybe 2 generations, depending on how you count them, but certainly 1.5 generations. It's going to take some time, so my respectful submission.
Right. At this point, Mr. Lloyd, we have to take our first break on our program, Jones and Company. But when we come back, we will continue the conversation with Mr. Lloyd. We'll be right back.